So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Today is the second Agrarian Change seminar series of this term, which is organized by the Journal of Agrarian Change. And many of you may know that the Agrarian Change seminar series basically ran in SOAS for many, many years since it started. And in recent years, it's become more of a wandering series across different places and sometimes only online. But I'm very pleased that we could do this one here at SOAS again, and it's to celebrate the launch of a very special issue. I just want to say thank you also, apart from all the contributors. I should say I'm Shreya Sinha. I'm one of the editors of the Journal of Agrarian Change, also SOAS alumni, and yeah, I convene the seminar series. So I just want to thank also Amod and Carlos, who are both online and who helped to organize this event today. And just for everybody's information, both online and offline, that this seminar is being recorded like most of our recent seminars. So they get recorded and they will be up on YouTube eventually. So yeah, if you're not comfortable being recorded, please choose your own action and words accordingly. And yeah, and with that, I hand over to Lorena to chair this event.
Thank you, Shreya. Thank you, Shreya. Hi all, good evening. My name is Lorena Lombardozzi. I'm a senior lecturer in political economy of development at SOAS. I'm a new member. I rejoined recently. And today we are here because we are launching, as Shreya said, a great special issue published this summer in the Journal of Agrarian Change, called Social Reproduction of Agrarian Change, Feminist Political Economy and Rural Transformations in the Global South. The special issue was edited by Alessandra Mezzadri here from SOAS, Sara Stevano from SOAS, Lynn Ossome from Makerere University, and also Anna Bargawi from SOAS. Today we have a fantastic lineup of feminist speakers. We will start with two of the four editors. Dr. Sara Stevano, who is a senior lecturer in economics here at SOAS and works in the fields of development economics and feminist political economy. She is obviously one of the editors of the special issue. Then Alessandra Mezzadri, who is also feminist and development political economist of labor and social reproduction. She's reader in global development and political economy at SOAS London. She's the author of the Sweatshop Regime for Cambridge University Press, lead author of the Social Life of Industrial Disputes for ILO, and editor of Marx in the Field for Anthem in 2000, a lot of things, and co-editor of the handbook for research on the global political economy of work. She has written extensively on the global labor issue, and she's currently working on a manuscript called Feminist Cartography of Social Reproduction and Global Development as Social Factory. Thank you. Then we have online, here you are, three fantastic speakers. First one, Cosku Celik. He's an assistant professor at Kadir University in Istanbul. She holds a PhD in political science from the Middle East Technical University. After completing her PhD, she worked as a postdoctoral fellow as visiting assistant professor at York University in Canada between 2019 and 2022. And her research interests lie at the intersection of global labor studies, development studies, and feminist political economy. She's also currently working, or I think she's done. Her book will be published soon, titled Extractivism Across Production and Social Reproduction Classes of Labor in Rural Turkey for Brill. Congrats. Then we have China Sajadian, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Anthropology at Vassar College. She's currently completing a book manuscript, Debt and Refugees, Syrian Farm Workers and the Politics of Displacement in Lebanon, which is based on a 2-year ethnographic fieldwork at the Lebanese-Syrian border. She received her PhD in anthropology at the City University of New York Graduate Center and was Everard postdoctoral fellow at Smith's College. And then to conclude, last but not least, Yeni, who is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at University of Western Cape. She has over 15 years of work experience in civil society organizations on land and agrarian issues in Southern Africa. She holds a Master in Development Studies from ISS, and her research include land reform, small-scale agriculture, and feminist organizing. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us online again. And without further ado, we'll give the floor to the editors.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
My job is done.
And just to say that we have the privilege of being chaired by one of our authors, so we will just hear about Lorena's work a little bit as well, because Lorena was part of the special issue indeed. Okay, let's see.
Let me just check what happened to the slides, because we're not seeing them there. Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Should be fine.
Great.
Okay.
All right, so such a pleasure to be here in more than one way. I just used to follow the Journal of Agrarian Change seminars as a student in the Paleolithic era. So it's such a pleasure to be able now to just have my moment in the spotlight and give one, especially for someone that is a total party crusher and is not an agrarianist, all right? So those that know me know that mostly I work on work and social reproduction across a number of debates and fields, but certainly I've not worked before on agrarian change issues, although I just managed to smuggle myself in for 15 to 20 years of the Journal of Agrarian Change seminars. So hopefully some of that has come by infusion and working with fantastic agrarianists. In fact, I want to start with how this idea came about, which is, you go back to the years, depressing years of the pandemic. Well, we just finished a project which in fact was on the feminist political economies of work and social reproduction, in which we just had very intense and insightful conversation with a number of people that were working on agrarian change, including one of the editors of the Journal of Agrarian Change, Bridget O'Loughlin, who has contributed to the special issue that I'm talking about in Review of International Political Economy. So the idea came originally from our discussion and exchanges with Bridget, besides, of course, our engagement with the journal for a very long time, discussion with Elena Baglioni that I see here, and of course with historic figures of the journals, another one that I just looking at now, Henry Bernstein, that's, been a mentor to many of us and a legend, a little bit of a legend overall. So this is how the idea started its early gestation, and so we're very pleased to see the launch. The journal issue came out in the summer, but it's a pleasure to now formally launch it. Now, before I go ahead, I would just like to, as in all the things I'm doing lately, to start with the acknowledgement of genocide. And I think it's just proper that every time that we refer to social reproduction in whichever forms, our heart goes first to those that are just experiencing the destruction, the total destruction of social reproduction, may that be in the reproductive infrastructures of life, like hospitals or schools, or the fruits of social reproduction itself, the children. In fact, the current ongoing Palestinian genocide has been defined by members of the United Nations like Philip Lazzarini as a war on children, exactly for the numbers of children that have died, never seen before in any other conflict in history. And a shout out here to the fact that we will host Francesca Albanese, which is the UN envoy on the Middle East, here at SOAS on the 11th of November. Do come for that. So, of course, we also acknowledge large-scale violence in other parts of the world, including in Ethiopia and Sudan. Now, getting back to our special issue, I would say that I'll start with the visual snapshot of the extraordinary diversity of the regions and the authors that we represent in this special issue. And so we have 12 papers which will deal with how we get together debates around social reproduction with debates around agrarian change. Now, when we read the agrarian change debates, we have to we have to acknowledge the fact that there is a very sort of rich literature that focuses on the gendered aspect of agrarian change, and we hope to build on that literature and contribute to that literature. So none of this is seen as competing or providing an alternative framework. However, the lens on social reproduction is also quite distinctive in the sense that its specific aim is to highlight the interrelations between productive and reproductive processes as they shape simultaneously life, work, and survival. So in this sense, we'll build on that literature, but we're also quite sure of how distinctive the type of contributions we try to make here. Now, because we just didn't want to preempt discussions from the beginning, what we have done as editors, after we just were gifted and sort of entrusted with this beautiful material, was to see which type of insights this material was giving us. So it's based on the author's interpretation of the task of putting together agrarian change and the social reproduction debates that we managed to get to an introduction where we want to highlight now before you 3 themes in which we think that we contribute to the literature. The first way in which we believe that our social reproduction interventions contribute to critical agrarian studies is by a qualification of what is the reproductive basis that regenerates classes of labor. Classes of labor is an analytical concept, a very lucky one, developed in fact by Henry, and refers to the variety of labor relations that we find, not just in rural areas, but across the global south and increasingly the global north, whereby you see labor in various instantiation and in various types of relations to the means of production, including land, to survival, and to work and life. Now, we contend, and I think the papers speak for themselves, that a social reproduction viewpoint can actually sort of expand our understanding of how the classes of labor regenerate, reproduce daily, intergenerationally, and with which type of dynamics related to the productive fabric in which they come to sort of act in. So particularly there are 4 papers that contribute to this first strand of broader contributions we claim to make to the literature of agrarian change. And these are by Cosku, Celik, who's one of our presenters that will talk about Turkey and process of proletarianization in relation to the rise of mining and natural resource industries in the rural countryside. In this line of contributions, we also place Lori's work on Uzbekistan and looking at rural differentiation through the lens, through the social reproduction lens of food. We placed Yi Liu's contributions on China and the intergenerational family planning and the way in which gendered labor has sustained Chinese development since the planning era. It was fantastic to work with Liu because that's a classic SOAS. We don't know that such amazing people are here, and Liu is in fact based in our anthropology department. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here with us today. And we have also the contributions by a very esteemed group of Indian feminist economist scholars, namely Smriti Rao, Smita Ramnarayan, Srisha Naidu, Anupama Uppal, and Avanti Mukherjee. So this is the first line of contribution. A second line refers to land, and land will appear in this special issue through a social reproduction lens, perhaps complicating some of the debates that we had thus far, not in all, but in a significant number of critical agrarian studies, particularly those concerned with the yields and productivity. So productivist readings of land, I think, falls short. This is at least what the social reproduction story tells us, to engage with what June Borras and others have called the strategic location of land and its key role for reproduction of even surplus populations. We will see Sta will deal with this issue in particular. And we have here another 4 sets of brilliant contributions, and surprisingly, 2 are based on South Africa. And we know that the distribution of land in South Africa since the end of apartheid has been an abysmal less than 4%. And we have the contribution by Brittany Bunce and Ben Cousins and Donna Hornby together, also with the separate one by Stade we'll hear about. We also have a story narrated by Sabayoshi with reference to Cambodia on the role the land play in the imaginary of struggles against dispossession in our story of women organizing around this issue. And also missing from our pictures, but very much in the special issue, Olena Lyubchenko's account of the Soviet primitive accumulation, what she called Soviet primitive accumulation, and the link between the strategic way in which the women's wing of the Communist Party then fought and the issues of social reproduction they faced. So finally, and I'll pass to my partner in crime of many, by now, many projects. The final lens we have is on global geographies reproducing varied agrarian life forms. So there are a number of pieces which will take a very innovative look of trying to rethink the countryside and the rural in a way that accounts for the extraordinary diverse process of transformation that these settings have gone through. And there is classic literature on global commodity chains that does this, and we see this reflected in the contribution by Laura Reynolds and Isabel Ibsen on Chile and Ecuador. But then we also have instead sort of quite original and less heard of frameworks where the authors tested themselves against the possibility to create a new way to look at this new global rural. So we have Sid Chakravarti and Ishita Sharma's work on the terraqueous territoriality of Goa, just to sort of tease you a little bit in reading these great contributions. And we also have, of course, China's work at the Lebanese-Syrian border, and we're only seeing Danish Khan's work on the rural-urban frontier in Pakistan. So just do have a look. These are like all extraordinary pieces of writing.
Great.
On methods.
Yeah, thank you, Ale. So if we can move to the next slide. So I'm just going to briefly conclude this introduction, and then we'll make sure that there is sufficient time for the three presenters who actually have their own research to share with all of you. But yeah, so as I think most or all of you know, the social reproduction research agenda is blossoming, and as such is an agenda in becoming, so to speak. And that means that the reflections on methodological approaches and methods that are suitable and well equipped to study social reproduction in general, but also in the context or in relation to agrarian change, are quite useful, particularly for people who want to move in this area of work, and for those of us who work in this area to have more clarity on what kind of methodological approaches we can get inspiration from. So I would like, so basically, this collection, apart from the themes that Alessandra has just highlighted, is also a very useful resource to consider which kind of methodological approaches and methods all of these scholars use in their work. So we reflect on this in the introduction, and there are a few more points in the written piece, but here I want to highlight a couple. The first is that across all of the papers, there is a deep engagement with the field, which is at the same time theoretically, very strongly theoretically grounded, and in many cases it has a theoretical aim. So the aim is not only to understand very deeply a certain context, a certain local reality, but to use this local knowledge and local reality in order to inform a theory. And this is quite important. I think this is perfectly compatible with the type of agrarian change literature that has been informed by Marxist political economy. And because many papers have this theoretical aim, you will see that many papers provide either extensions of key concepts in agrarian change and social reproduction, or they develop new concepts. And so just to give you a couple of quick examples, Danish Canon piece paper extends the concept of the agrarian-urban frontier, looking at the case of Pakistan. China, and we will hear more about this later, I'm sure, develops the concept of reproductive binds in her work on Syrian farm workers in Lebanon. And the outcome of this is that this literature leads to a more nuanced and complex understanding of capitalism on a global scale. Capitalism seen from different locations and viewpoints, as well as through different forms of resistance to it. So this is all incredibly useful. The second point about methods is that, again, a cross-cutting feature across all of the papers is that the authors have based their analysis on a long-term engagement with the field. And this long-term engagement occurs through a variety of methods for primary data collection, primarily qualitative, but we also have a couple of examples of quantitative methods for data collection. Lorena's work in Uzbekistan is in part based on the use of a small-scale household survey. Rao and colleagues in India have used a small-scale time-use survey in combination with qualitative techniques in order to understand work in the 3 villages in rural India. But also, all of the authors engage with secondary literature, and they tend to take a historical approach to the understanding, in order to foster a deep understanding of the context that they're looking at. Now, moving to the very last slide before we hand over to Cosku. I think that so far we have focused more on highlighting key themes to understand the social reproduction of agrarian change, but there is something to be said about what this agrarian change analysis also adds to our understanding of social reproduction in general. So 3 points here. The first is that a focus on the agrarian South reveals the complexity of social, class, and labor relations. I mean, the concept of classes of labor, of course, was mentioned earlier. But in a way, here, we really see how these relations are predominantly porous, flexible, fragmented, segmented. And on the one hand, I think that this captures very strongly the idea of the fleshy, messy, indeterminate stuff of everyday life that Cindy Katzo talks about when she talks about social reproduction in a very widely used definition of it. But it goes also beyond that, because it foregrounds such complexity as a core feature of both social reproduction and capitalist production, and in fact also the intersections between the two domains in the contemporary agrarian South. And this provides a very strong counter-narrative to more compartmentalized understandings of social reproduction and capitalist production. And in part also for this reason, this connects to the second point where we see that across the papers in the collection, the household remains a very strong unit of analysis. But it is very much interrogated depending on the specific context. And of course, this is a point that has been made a long time ago. I mean, more powerfully, I think, by Bridget O'Loughlin, who I don't know if she's here. But it's always worth, you know, reminding ourselves that as we talk about households, what households are is very context specific, to say the least. But also how households need to be seen alongside other social formations and categories that might be relevant in different contexts, such as the kinship, the extended family, the community, and grassroots groups. And this is also, you know, some of the papers also deal more specifically with the relation with the state. And finally, I mean, again, many people here will know this is not something that has emerged in this special issue, but this special issue very much confirms the centrality of land for social reproduction in the agrarian, but I think not only in the agrarian South. Land, which is important not only as a source of food and income, but also to reproduce the so-called social and the cultural. This is important for two reasons. So one is that the centrality of land is something that has not emerged at all from the social reproduction scholarship, which is focused on the global north. But also because it pushes us toward, or it pushes the social reproduction agenda towards broader questions of survival, livelihood, and also ecology. And on this note, I'll end. And yes, I think we'll take questions at the end, but we have the three presentations that reflected the three key themes that Alessandra talked about. So we can hand over to Cosku.
Colleagues, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I do have to leave a little bit early. So could I go after Cosku? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Does she want to go first instead? I don't know.
China, do you want to go first? So then maybe
You can go.
Just you fine with that?
That's okay.
As you wish. I can go second. It's no problem. I just certainly if I go third, I don't think I would be able to. I would have to leave to teach, unfortunately. But just please go.
Maybe you should start then. I don't know. Both is okay for me. Okay, then I'm starting.
1 second.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for, it's a big pleasure to be here to join you today. Also, it's a big pleasure to be part of this fantastic special issue in my favorite rural development journal ever. In my paper entitled The Social Reproduction of Natural Resource Extraction and Gendered Labor Regimes in Rural Turkey, I tried to unveil the inherently gendered character of the transformation of rural livelihood in resource extraction regions. In order to do that, I referred to miners' wives as the producers and reproducers of the classes of extractive labor in the processes of commodification and diversification of rural livelihood. And in contrast to the representation of women as shadowy secondary figures in the extractive committees, I basically defined miners' wives as producers and reproducers of these communities and reveal the ways in which extractive capital exploit women's work as miners' wives and as well as agricultural workers. In order to do that, I combined two sets of literature: critical agrarian political economy and social reproduction feminism, early social reproduction feminism, as Alessandra puts it. Natural resource extraction in the global south under neoliberalism indicates the exploitation of both nature and the partly dispossessed farmers generated by the neoliberal transformation of agriculture. These partly dispossessed farmers of the global south basically constitute a source of cheap labor force for the extractive capital. Here, I use the term dispossession not merely as land dispossession, but instead a loss of non-market access to the means of production and social reproduction, such as land, housing, clean water, firewood, etc.
And this wave of dispossession under neoliberalism in the global south led to proletarianization and hyper-urbanization. However, this wave of proletarianization and urbanization in the global south has not been straightforward, and a considerable part of the populations in the global south is still rural. That is why Henry Bernstein's concept of classes of labor, explains the rural class relations under neoliberalism in the best possible manner. Basically, they are defined as a part of the laboring populations who are neither dispossessed of all means of reproducing itself, nor in possession of sufficient means to reproduce itself, and they basically depend directly or indirectly on the sale of their labor power for their daily reproduction. Actually, the term classes of labor offers a methodological opportunity to overcome dualistic modes of analysis within the workforce, such as urban versus rural, agricultural versus non-agricultural, landowning versus landless, etc. And therefore, it allows to capture the multiplicity of labor market conditions along the lines of gender, race, and caste. And I argue that transformation of rural livelihood in the extractive regions is inherently gendered, and the holistic analysis of it necessitates attention to the central role played by women within the classes of extractive labor. Therefore, the third duality that needs to be overcome is between paid and unpaid workforce. And I use social reproduction feminism because rural livelihood diversification indicates a strategy of rural households who are unable to meet the conditions of social reproduction. It basically indicates sets of survival strategies and coping mechanisms through gender division of labor, by supplying labor to global production networks, to rural industries, capitalist farms, family farms, or reproductive work within the household. And rising extractive investments constitute kind of an opportunity for the rural populations to diversify their income sources without migrating to urban centers. However, still, the employment created by these investments is mostly precarious, informal, or low wage, and most of the time income generated by these male sectors, let's say, is insufficient for the survival of the family. And therefore, these investments do not create male breadwinner, female caregiver form of proletarian households. Therefore, women in the rural extractive regions are the last guarantors of the survival of the family through various types of works and social and services, just like the women Mies defined in her field work in Narsipor, the lace making woman. And also, as this basically indicates feminization of agricultural labor as well, because, but here I do not define feminization of agricultural labor as a quantitative increase in the participation of agricultural work. Instead, I mean the intensification of exploitation of women's labor in agricultural while lacking control over production. Also, rising extractive investments restructures the conditions of social reproduction and women's role as subsistence producers, basically. Here, I use the term subsistence production to mean both farming and also housework. It's important to see how expropriation of smallholder farmland for extractive investments and the ecologic impacts of these investments limit women's access to the means of subsistence farming, and how women's exploitation of women's unpaid work as minors' wives change their reproductive work. And therefore, I argued that in order to make a holistic analysis of the classes of labor in the extractive regions, there's a need to pay attention to the underwater part of the iceberg economy, because the tip of the iceberg in this case, which indicates the relationship between the extractive capital and formal wage labor in mining, gives only a partial and a quite misleading picture actually. But their relationship is built upon the subsistence peasant farming of women, housework of women, or expropriation of farmland, expropriation of means of production and social reproduction, etc. That is why I use the iceberg model of capitalist patriarchal economies as defined by Maria Mies. I do not have time to, discuss what happened as a general trend in the Turkish countryside. That's why I continue with the findings of my fieldwork, which I did in Western Anatolia, Turkey. It was a very long fieldwork, around 6 years. In the Soma coal basin, the coal mining basically dates back to the 19th century. And until 2005, small-scale firms, some state economic enterprises, etc., extracted coal in Soma. And in 2005, as part of the coal rush policies of the Justice and Development Party governments in Turkey, coal extraction was privatized through royalty tender. I will not go in detail of this specific form of privatization. And since 2005, along with the rising investments in the coal mines, actually an orientation towards underground, quite labor-intensive mining took place, and the number of miners increased drastically. And before the 2000s, local populations in the Soma coal basin were basically engaged in tobacco farming. But as a result of the privatization of tobacco factories of a state economic enterprise named Tekel and the enactment of the new tobacco law, basically local tobacco producers started to, experience a significant absence of state support. They lost their income security, and the annual production amount dropped drastically. And as a result, the male members of the local families started to work in the underground coal mines in the mid-2000s. And even though tobacco production dropped drastically and men started to work in the mines, instead of a simple de-agrarianization, what's happened in the Soma coal basin was livelihood diversification through gender division of paid and unpaid works. Because while male members of the household started to work in the mines, women maintain agricultural work in different forms, such as agricultural wage work in capitalist farms, petty commodity production on their own land or through tenancy, and subsistence production, production for their own consumption. And land expropriation for coal mines basically restructured the imperatives of social reproduction very, in a very significant manner. Expropriations for the mines, for the coal-fired power plants and highway constructions in the villages led the local populations to move to the town center, or some of them. I took this photo from the mine site basically, and as you can see, the village houses are right across the mine site, which is very which means very unhealthy way of living. And they had to move to the town centers, and they basically lost their access to land as a means of social reproduction, both to their homestead and the agricultural land. And this increased their dependency on the wage income received from mining. For example, women who had to move to the town centers could no longer maintain subsistence farming, whereas those who still live in those villages, basically they have mine sites at their doorstep, which means there are problems such as land, infertile land, etc. Which is very related to the next issue, the ecological destruction, because the Bakırçay River flows through the basin and it irrigates the farmlands across the basin. And its pollution due to the mine constructions and construction of coal washing facilities basically led to fertility loss and land degradation. This did not only, change their relation to land or fertility loss, etc. They had to start using drilling water, and production costs rose drastically within this process. And when I have a look at women's work in the basin, basically mutual and internal relationship between production and social reproduction determines their work, and their work include unpaid subsistence farming, unpaid family farming, daily agricultural wage work, which is quite low-waged, informal, etc., and unpaid reproductive work at home. For the petty commodity producer households, for the households who maintain tobacco production, they basically use the income men receive from mining as a means to finance farming. And in terms of the unpaid reproductive work, the women have two responsibilities basically: growing fruits and vegetables or animal breeding for household consumption, I mean subsistence farming, and reproduction of workers within the households. And basically, as mentioned by the women, I quoted here, they literally never stop. For example, a tobacco producer woman, an average tobacco producer woman wakes up at 3 a.m. in the morning and then goes to farm, and then she string tobacco, and then they dry them outside, they clean there, and then they take care of their children, etc., and they prepare the food baskets for themselves and for their husbands, and they can go to bed at around 11 p.m., etc., and after a 4-hour sleep their new working day starts. And all the women I define subsistence farming in a very positive manner as a legacy of the good old days. And by the good old days, basically, they meant the time before the extractive developmentalism of the Erdogan governments. I mean, the time when their lives were not market or cash dependent and their husbands had not started working in the mines. And neoliberal transformation of agriculture and land grabs for mine investments together led to the commodification of their subsistence through increasing market and cash dependency for their social reproduction. To conclude, actually, I argue that the case of Turkey and the Soma Coal Basin unveils the key aspects of how neoliberal agricultural policies, along with the mega investments in natural resource industries, have resulted in the dispossession of small-scale farmers, and how recently and partly dispossessed farmers have become a source of cheap labor power for extractive capital as well as for agribusiness capital through gender division of work. And finally, how these patterns of accumulation and dispossession have formed the classes of extractive labor whose production and social reproduction are built upon the exploitation of women's work. Thank you for listening to.
Are we going?
Yes, straight to China.
Straight to China. So thank you, Cosku. We'll go with the Q&A at the end. Thank you. Amazing. China, hi. The floor is yours. I will send you a private message when you have about 5 minutes.
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you just need to click slideshow China.
Great.
You're muted.
Can you?
Thank you, everyone, for your patience, and thank you to my colleagues for letting me go ahead of time. I have to teach at 1:30 my time here in New York, so I apologize that I won't be present for at least part of the Q&A. And thank you all for being here. Thank you to the special issue editors and authors for the opportunity to come together. So I want to say that as an anthropologist, I can't help but tell a story. So I will be framing my presentation in a slightly narrative form, sitting with the particulars of the work that I did, but I hope that in the course of proceeding, the more generalizable significance and theoretical implications will become clear. Let me just... So just to give you a sense of the geographical location of my work, so this is the Bekaa Valley plain of Lebanon. It's 120 kilometers. So this is what it looks like in relation to Syria. And this is where my primary interlocutors were coming from, which is the countryside of Arraqqa. And many of them were coming specifically from the communities that were flooded by the iconic Soviet-funded Euphrates Dam project. That's beyond the scope of this presentation, but is an important part of the history of their migration patterns to Lebanon as waged workers and as seasonal migrant farm workers. The Bekaa Valley, as some of you might know, and thank you, Ale, for mentioning the ongoing violence that's happening across the Middle East, but especially in Palestine, Lebanon, and Sudan and elsewhere in the whole region. The Bekaa is currently topping headlines as Israeli military bombardment is not only affecting that region, but also Beirut and South Lebanon. But what many do not know in the midst of this region topping headlines is that it's also the region's historic breadbasket, cultivated throughout the year with vineyards, olive trees, and a variety of vegetables and fruit for domestic consumption and regional and transnational export. This valley was also one of the highest recipients of Syrian refugees in the world per capita when the Syrian conflict began over a decade ago in 2011. Many of the Syrians who ended up in these camps were previously labor migrants who had longstanding ties to the region as seasonal farm workers and found themselves immobilized in Lebanon during the war. Today, in a cruel twist of fate, many of these Syrians are now contending with when and how to move back to Syria as they flee the military bombardment that has engulfed the very place that gave them refuge 13 years ago. So my colleagues have powerfully argued that studying the social reproduction of agrarian change provides a novel vantage point from which to understand the complex global geographies of agrarian life across the rural-urban divide. And of course, as the ongoing situation in Lebanon and Palestine and Syria makes plain, the politics of displacement lie at the heart of such questions as agricultural livelihoods become ever more fragmented, pushing some family members to migrate in search of waged work and leaving others bound in place or in a state of protracted displacement far from their land and traditional sources of subsistence, and often saddled with debts and mounting reproductive obligations inside and outside of the home. So in the rest of this talk, I want to introduce you to one of the places where I spent much of my research and which is the feature of this article. And I promise to keep this under 12 minutes for sure. This is a camp for Syrian farm workers run by a shawish. Shawish are patron-like figures who run camps for Syrian farm workers, but they also exist in Turkey and in Jordan. Though these camps have existed since the 1980s and especially since the 1990s, they expanded significantly a decade ago to accommodate those displaced by the war in Syria. Residents of these camps comprise Lebanon's largest and lowest paid agricultural labor force. There are hundreds of camps like this, many of which operate through an elaborate credit debt system in which workers go into debt to the shawish who run these camps to cover the cost of their tents and their yearly rent. They also go into debt for cash to cover their everyday consumption needs, healthcare, and major occasions such as weddings and funerals, reproductive occasions, of course. In exchange, the shawish is responsible for securing agricultural jobs for camp residents and transporting them to work in flatbed trucks like this. In this camp, as in others, the shawish lent credit to each household as what was euphemistically referred to as a family wage under the name of the eldest male residing in each tent. The unspoken rule was that male elders wielded primary decision-making power about requests for credit, while women, teenage boys, and girls and children performed the majority of agricultural work. As in many other contexts of debt-based labor recruitment, certainly beyond the Middle East, the Shawish system secured workers' baseline survival by squeezing women's waged and unwaged labor. Gendered and generational norms regarding the difference between what was called girls' work and men's work played a key role in reinforcing those dynamics. It remains an unquestioned principle that married men in the camp should not engage in the drudgery of weeding, planting, and harvesting, tasks that were considered demeaning and feminized, as in other contexts. Within waged agricultural work, only one job was deemed appropriate for married male heads of household and older bachelors, the overseer, whose responsibility was to supervise their female kin and younger kin, and pressure them to work faster and manage the timing of their breaks. The value of a female worker's wage was only 2/3 of the overseer's wage. So the designation of certain tasks as girls' work or others as men's work clearly contributed to wage repression, although camps rarely narrated it to me in such terms. But I want to be clear that these divisions of labor were not simply cultural conventions particular to the Middle East. Rather, they signified a much more systemic problem facing migrant farm workers across the world, namely how wage differentials are normalized along gendered and generational lines. They are also rooted in a regional history of uneven agrarian development that long predates the war, and which certainly I don't have much time to explain, so I'll keep it extremely brief. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, and particularly following the accession of Bashar al-Assad to the Syrian presidency, Syria's centrally planned economy progressively shifted away from the paradigm of state-led agriculture toward the globalized market economy, including liberalizing trade regulations and subjecting previously state-mandated prices to competitive markets. One of the unintended outcomes of this process was a growing need for cash among rural Eastern Syrian households, especially those in the countryside of Raqqa, which pushed unprecedented numbers of women and teenagers into seasonal waged work to supplement their incomes or to secure their families' basic needs, particularly women from that part of Syria. It was during this period of liberalization that women and children from Eastern Syria began joining seasonal work teams coordinated by these Shawish camp headmen. Many of these Shawish were upwardly mobile Syrian labor migrants themselves who had built up the necessary capital to recruit workers across borders. The reverberating political and economic effects of the war in Syria exacerbated those sort of trends toward feminization and class differentiation. Facing rising competition in Lebanon's highly unregulated market-led food system, so you had a kind of post-socialist state-led system alongside a market-led one, Lebanese agriculturalists sought to drive down production costs by hiring low-paid workers from Shawish camps. This reinforced an already long-standing trend toward contract-based tenant farming in Lebanon, which shifted the risks of cultivation and marketing onto a narrowing class of farmers, known as daman in Arabic, with the necessary capital to hire workers from Shawish camps. So alongside this growing drive for cheap labor throughout the war, the expansion of Shawish camps, it reflected an unfolding crisis of social reproduction among the Syrian farm workers themselves. Because this had to do with the conditions of their displacement. One of the chief struggles that many of these Syrian refugees faced throughout the war was the rising cost of living in Lebanon, as their wages as farm workers were insufficient to support their displaced families year-round. So unable to return to Syria on a seasonal basis, as they once had, they began to incur debts to Shawish, who were running these camps, who offered sources of income and affordable housing in the absence of alternatives. These emergent divisions of labor between Lebanese tenant farmers, Shawish labor brokers, overseers, and feminized farm workers underscore a classic agrarian insight. For some, debt is a sign of capitalization, and for others, precarization. Women and their children were not passive recipients of these conditions, but nevertheless, their grievances, negotiations, and plans for the future were most often addressed inward toward their household kin. This inward dynamic is a key example of how debt-based labor systems diffuse farm workers' collective organizing power and increase the rate of labor exploitation. The Shawish wage pooling system, this family wage system, placed households as the immediate domain and frontier of labor negotiation and struggle. Under the pressures of household indebtedness, daily familial life often revolved primarily around how to balance the flow of credit wages against the cost of fulfilling their reproductive needs and aspirations. So one key terrain of interfamilial struggle was marriage costs. Unmarried women in the camp were keenly aware of how the timing of their marriages was based on a difficult trade-off. For families facing acute liquidity problems, marrying their daughters offered a quick infusion of cash through the bride wealth payment. So bride wealth is very common in Eastern Syria. Yet this had to be balanced against the long-term loss of the value of their wages as farm workers. So these trade-offs were tied to the temporal pressures of debt itself, which involved a constant negotiation between immediate reproductive needs and longer-term preparations for return to Syria. For families with a high number of dependents and unmarried young men, these trade-offs placed unmarried women in a difficult double bind, where their marriages were continually deferred as their labor burdens across the continuum of waged and unwaged work mounted. These struggles over bride wealth are a key example of what I refer to in this paper as reproductive binds. The gendering of debt was also importantly not a static attribute of sex or age, as adult women and adolescent boys were also paid according to the wage rate for girls' work. This led to a number of household struggles over the threshold between childhood and adulthood among teenage boys who were reaching the age of puberty, as they often insisted to their parents that they were getting too old for girls' work. Such grievances and household-level struggles demonstrate that although gendered and generational divisions of labor were seemingly well-defined, they existed on a spectrum that was subject to contestation. It shows that the pressures of household indebtedness were not simply reinforcing sexual divisions of labor, but were also social processes of gendering labor. And I'll conclude here. These Syrian farm workers' dilemmas are, of course, historically specific, and in some ways quite regionally specific, but far from unique in many other senses. And they have much to tell us about both classic and contemporary agrarian questions. Debt, as we know, and as I discussed in the paper, was central to foundational debates about agrarian change going back to Lenin, Kautsky, and Chayanov. Then, and as today, debt is conceived as a key lever of agrarian capitalism, a force of class differentiation and displacement in the countryside, and an increasingly widespread regime of labor intensification and exploitation. But from a feminist perspective, debt is also intimately tied to crises of social reproduction. Pioneering scholars of gender have long noted how the exploitation of feminized labor remains an enduring and deepening feature of agrarian change. So this underscores the necessity of examining the effects of indebtedness and displacement relationally across different domains of social life, especially across the continuum of waged and unwaged work and within the household. 13 years into the war in Syria, I believe that these farm workers' struggles are a mirror of what is to come across the world, as economic dislocation, mass indebtedness, mass displacement, and ecological destruction are not an exception, but an enduring reality practically everywhere we look. And as Syrian families today, who I'm in ongoing contact with, navigate when and where and how to move across these landscapes, devastated not once by war, but multiple times, as well as economic crisis. It is the feminized labors of caregiving, subsistence work, household budgeting, and low-paid waged work that bear the heaviest burden of creating any semblance of stability in the meantime. But in their aggregate form, these are indeed the everyday familial relationships that are redefining agricultural livelihoods, certainly not only in this region, but throughout the world. And thank you all for coming here today. I'll keep it here. Thank you.
No, we just go ahead because she has to leave. Yes. So what do you want to do? Ask a couple of questions. You have a couple of questions.
Because he has to leave, or we will go to the next.
If there are any questions.
Do you have any
particularly for
questions for China? Okay.
Or also online, I don't know.
Not at this point, but I'm sure that we'll
Yeah,
get back
there
to
will
you.
be time to do your questions. We go on with the third and last speaker, Yeni. Hi, Sara. Can you hear us? Do you have slides to share? No? Okay, so you have 12 minutes. I will write you a message when we have about 2 minutes or 3 minutes.
All right.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, greetings, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this panel. Very excited that the special issue is finally being launched. All right, so I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'll just talk through my paper, just a few points that I would like to emphasize. So first, I'll just give the title of my paper and the background to it, and then what I'm arguing. So the title is Land, Natural Resources, and the Social Reproduction of South Africa's Relative Surplus Population. It's part of it's a chapter in my PhD thesis, which I'm currently completing. And it was influenced, so when I'm studying former labor tenants in South Africa who were dispossessed of their land, I mean, historically, over time, but the most recent dispossession happened in 1997, where they were evicted by a white farmer, and they were dumped in the informal settlements in a small town called Greytown. And they lived there for 10 years. And in those 10 years, they were fighting to go back and reclaim the land that they were forcibly evicted from. And so I was curious, because now they are back on their land since 2008. And I was curious to know what happens when people who've been displaced and whose efforts of social reproduction have been compromised systematically for years. What happens when they get their land back in the context of the crisis of social reproduction, in the crisis of capitalism? What happens when they get their land back with limited or no state support? What kind of land tenure arrangements emerge? What kind of land uses emerge? What do they make sense of themselves in terms of belonging as well? So that's the context. And I entered in these debates on social reproduction. This was after my fieldwork. And when I went there, I somehow anticipated that I'm going to find people producing, there'll be accumulation here and there of capital, there'll be some class formation happening here and there. That was my assumption before fieldwork. But I got there and none of that was happening. But there were land uses, but there wasn't any capital accumulation. No one was investing in agriculture and accumulating capital. No one was hiring labor and so on. But people were producing just for subsistence and doing many other things with land. So I come back and I'm analyzing my data and I'm reading, okay, how do I make sense of this now? I didn't find any accumulation which I had anticipated before. And I engaging with debates on social reproduction. And I was quite influenced at the time by the scholars, feminist scholars in the global South who are thinking about social reproduction in agrarian societies where a lot of people are surplus to the needs of capital, where unemployment is very high, and even those that are employed are are earning poverty wages and cannot meet their reproduction costs, right? So I was engaging with those debates around and what questions that these scholars were asking or inviting us to ask, questions of what do these surplus populations, who's taking care of them? How are they surviving in the crisis of social reproduction and in the crisis of capitalism broadly, which is pushing more and more people to the margins, and we're seeing a growing number or growing surplus populations all around us. So that was so when I saw the call for the special issue, my intention was to enter those debates, to look at how the surplus population in agrarian societies in the global south are responding to the crisis, and what is the role of land and natural resources in that context. And that's what my paper tries to do. So I contribute using the data from this community that I spoke to you about earlier, where I did life histories, in-depth interviews, and some surveys of households, just to get a sense of who has what. And what I find is, in terms of livelihoods, strategies or activities, people combine, which is of course common in poor households, to combine different strategies. So there's subsistence farming, people are keeping livestock, even though it's small herds, goats, cattle. Some are engaging in informal businesses like trading, petty commodity trading, but there's other things that people, and some are employed casually and occasionally on commercial farms, which is why then I use the relative surplus population, which in a way covers the kind of people I found in my site. Some are stagnant, some are floating, they're in and out of employment seasonally, and some are old and surviving on state social support, which is minimal. So I look at households, and like I said, I'm influenced by feminist scholars who argued that in the context of where the state is providing minimal support in terms of social protection, and in the context where capital is also limited in terms of jobs, right? Giving people jobs, then the household becomes this center that has to shoulder the burdens of capital. But what about household? What then in the household? How do then these households reproduce themselves and their communities? And then that's why I focus on land access, but also the labor within households that converts resources into usable goods. So I argue that there are three processes that are important and that aid social reproduction in this particular case. The first one is land redistribution. That is the starting point, to redistribute land to people who are dispossessed, to the people who are landless. That is the first point. The second one is not just land, but how that land is then accessed, who can access it. So the terms of access, who can control it and who can't. So the kind of tenure arrangements that emerges. And I found, or at least in my argument, I argue that it's socially embedded tenure arrangements that enable social reproduction. So it's land redistribution, but the means of access and control of land and by extension natural resources. And the third factor is unpaid gendered labor within households, which is largely performed by women, but not exclusively. So it's the combination of these three elements that I argue facilitate or aid social reproduction of the surplus population. So these three processes, they reinforce each other, right? Like I said, it's not just land that is crucial, but it's how it's controlled, and then the gendered labor that is required to turn resources into consumable goods that enable people to live. So I was also influenced by work of James Ferguson, who writes about the South African context, talks about the many things people do with land, and it challenges the narrow framing of land reform in South Africa, which I also do in the paper partly, but more broadly in the thesis, that it's very much fixated on land as a productive resource for capital accumulation. And that's how land reform in South Africa has been framed. And so if people are not accumulating profit and producing for the market in a particular way, whatever they do, then it's regarded as a failed land reform. But what do people who reclaim land think about it? Do they think it's a failed reform? And I argue no, they don't think it's a failed land reform. So I look at, so what are the other things that people do with land, and that are often neglected in the land question discourse in South Africa, but also very neglected in the policy discourse. So, for example, housing, people wanting housing to live in decent lives. These are people who were dumped in informal settlements, living in tents, and who can now build with limited resources, of course, but who can at least build houses that they can live in dignity. So that's one of the things that I found that people do with land. People practice cultural, they engage in cultural practices, which is an important aspect of social reproduction, the cultural reproduction, which is but often underplayed broadly in social reproduction discourse. I look at what people use land for rituals, but also I ask, why are these rituals so important? Why is it important for people to connect with their ancestors? And what is the function of land in that respect, apart from keeping livestock which people use to communicate with ancestors? But they also build particular structures, certain houses which are sacred, which are essential for how people see themselves, but also how people reproduce themselves. And these are some of the things that I found in my research that is central in how people reproduce themselves, and is one of the key uses of land. And then, of course, there's the usual one, keeping livestock and production, but also recreation, playgrounds for children. These are all the things that people need and use land for, which again is missing in the main stream discourse around land reform or the land question in South Africa, which I challenge. Yeah, so I don't have much to say. I think I've said the gist.
I think you're done. Oh,
But I have concluding. I have concluding remarks. Yeah, so to say, the crisis of social reproduction and the increasing of the surplus populations. If I think about this, I mean, this is not just a South African case, but I'm just thinking about it because that's where I do my research. It necessitates that we rethink land and what is land for, and that we rethink here, in particular, the framing of land reform that tends to just focus on a particular kind of production, especially because now actually there's more debates on the de-agrarianization thesis that South Africa is more is no longer agrarian, and it's more about services. So what people need are jobs. People are moving to urban areas, which is true, but actually we are seeing land occupations in urban areas. So the question of land does not disappear simply because people need jobs. So this just the gist of the paper, to say land is really central for thinking about social reproduction and post transformation broadly. So I'll end there. That's what my paper is about. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you all the speaker for this very geographically diverse yet coherent investigation of the multiple dimension of uneven social reproduction, which we are all part of. So now we open the floor, both digital and real, for Q&A. So please bear with me if I don't see, yeah, raise hands, raise digital hands or real hands. Yes, thank you. Yeah, please. Yes, hi. Can you please introduce
Yes,
yourself?
thank you so much. I'm Dr. Aksharba. I'm a C Global Development student here at SOAS. So my question is related to direct cash disbursement to the head of the family. Probably it was Lebanon. So don't you think that direct cash reimbursement to the female in the family could actually improve the gender position in that sense? Is there any criticism going on to the policy of the government for that purpose? Because I know in Pakistan, there is a direct cash, giving to the female, especially so that she has an entitlement to the land and she has also this empowerment coming from that. So why is this going on in Lebanon, and why there's no criticism over this policy?
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Shall we have China take it first because she'll have to
Okay,
leave soon.
you want,
Yeah.
yeah, then China, yes, please answer to this one and we will collect the. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and I apologize to all of you again that I must leave early. I'll probably have to leave right after answering this important question. So I guess the first way that I would answer it is saying that this is not a state policy mandated by Lebanon, but rather something that's emergent within the prevailing relations of production in agriculture. And so this is not mandated by the state. Part of the reason that these kinds of debt relations emerge is in part because pretty much from the outset of its independence from the French mandate, it has been a market-led model of state development, which means that there are very few regulations on worker protections, particularly in agriculture. So this is something that was emergent within the class relations. So that's one aspect. To the question of whether some kind of cash disbursement directly to women would ameliorate the situation, I think that that's something that a lot of UN agencies, charities, and NGOs set out to do with varying levels of success, but often it has sometimes perverse outcomes, particularly when it is tied to microfinance. So something that a lot of families kind of contended with was, and it's not something that I mentioned in this presentation, but essentially these are all privatized networks of both care and work. And in part, it's about the continuum of those different kinds of needs. And so in the absence of the ability to rely on the sources of subsistence that the Syrian state, even as it was liberalizing, was providing to people, they were ever more dependent on privatized networks, which include development organizations, very often which gave loans with weighty interest-bearing obligations. So if they wanted to sort of reduce their dependence on these camp systems, it meant potentially taking on the risks of an interest-bearing loan to a private bank or an NGO without the same kind of social thickness, let's say, that living in this camp community afforded to them, even as it highly regulated the mobility and value of their labor. So I don't think that there are easy kinds of solutions to this situation because of the configuration of shifting dynamics, not least the effects of war and economic crisis on decimating the state capacities of both countries and the devaluation of their currencies. So there's so much at play at once in this region, which makes often humanitarian objectives to sort of circumvent and ameliorate the situation not necessarily helpful in some cases. But certainly, if you'd like to email me and speak more about this, I would be happy to address your question in further depth. And that goes for anyone in the audience. Unfortunately, since I have to leave, if you want to send me an email, I am very happy to address any question that you have about this work. And I have to go, but I want to thank all of you so very much. I apologize, but I have to leave early.
Thank you, China. Enjoy your lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. All right. Yes, so now, Rosie, we still have around 35 minutes, so please feel free to ask any questions, clarifications, or
Doubt.
doubt. I don't know, maybe I can also ask something, but I just want to give space for, I don't know, first row, second row, I think that you guys.
Lorena, maybe while people are thinking of other questions, can I add something to this question on
course,
cash
of
payments
course.
to women? Of course, I'm not talking about this case, which I know very little about only. I've only read China's wonderful paper, which I highly recommend. It's been a great contribution to our special issue. But just in general, I mean, of course, there are different reasons why cash payments are made to women. China mentioned microfinance. There are also cash transfer programs, conditional and unconditional, which now are so popular and basically ubiquitously present across the global south. Now, the one key objection from a feminist perspective is that why is it the case that cash is given to women? And normally there is this one basic underlying assumption, which is that women spend resources in ways that are more oriented towards the well-being of the family in relation to men. And this might well be true empirically in many contexts, but then there is a problem in terms of thinking that we can achieve a better welfare and well-being provisioning for populations by giving, by in a way exploiting women's traditional roles as carers, while often not changing more structural conditions of welfare and well-being provisioning, right? So it is true that perhaps receiving a cash payment could be empowering on an individual basis for some women, because it gives them maybe some leverage for the organization of everyday life or the renegotiation of some responsibilities. But overall, I think that, from a feminist perspective, there is a strong critical point that can be made. Yeah, sorry, just.
Good, yeah, no, great point, thank you. So we have two questions online. So one was for China, but I think it's still worth it to mention it. So for food for thought, we're just wondering about you telling the story of migrant workers and social reproduction without telling particular history of imperialism in the study area. And I think it's a fair question. She might not have the time to explain and explore this dimension, but yes, thank you for raising the point. And then we have a question for all the speakers and editors, which is, underlying in social reproduction is the gender division of labor, as it is often leads to a feminization of responsibility. The concept links well with structural impact on social reproduction, but speaks very little to the norms, which can be also understood as structures. How do you all understand and think of the role of social norms in social reproduction and the feminization of responsibility? Great question as well. So should we start with online speakers? Cosku, yes.
Thank you, and it's actually a very important question. I think social reproduction framework also helps to underline the impact of how, on the one hand, social norms are used in terms of labor inclusion, labor control, etc. Mechanisms, and also how they're also transformed along with the changing imperatives of social reproduction. In the case of the Somako Basin, for example, which is this is included in the paper as well, but of course this was a very short presentation. The role of the Islamic networks, because it's mostly a Muslim community. Basically, they were working as invisible economies of care, as the concept developed by Jens Lerche in one of his very influential articles, and as well as the working as an economy, solidarity economy, or as an invisible economy of care. Some Islamic networks were operating as labor control mechanisms as well, because for many of the workers, for miners, for agricultural workers, etc., for the local labor power, those religious networks basically constituted a more reliable and easier way of organizing compared to a class-based labor, leftist, etc. organization. But in terms of the, in terms of, organizing the consent of the laboring populations to the extractive developmentalism of the capital and the state, it was very influential. But on the other hand, they were kind of, they were, establishing, creating some solidarity mechanisms for them to survive under the very precarious and insecure conditions of social reproduction. I hope this answer helps a little.
Thank you, yes. Sara, would you like to say something?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I agree. It's really a good question, a big one too. And yes, I agree with the first part of the question that a big part of social reproduction is about the gender division of labor. And if I think of the work Federici, the Caliban and the Witch book, which offers a really historical account of how does work get divided in gendered ways historically under capitalism, right? So and the structure that are put in place to normalize it. I think the question talks about how it's now part of the norm. The feminization of particular tasks has been normalized, and yes, it is structural because there are structures put in place to keep particular sexes in a particular roles, and that has, of course, implications also for access to resources. So I agree that a big part of it is about is structural issues. But I think if we think about the history of these divisions of labor, in a way, it helps to. I'm not saying it's easy, but at least it helps if we think about interventions. If we think about interventions, whether it's from the state perspective of how then to lessen the burden on women who are caught up in these norms in terms of so it helps at least to understand that these are not natural. It's not, even though it's naturalized as Federici likes to put it, but it's not. Which means it can be adapted. It is adaptable. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Ali, yes.
Yeah, I will take the question on social reproduction structure versus social norm. I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy there. And if it's a literature that speaks only about the division of labor more structurally, is the literature on the feminization of labor, which actually explore different workspaces in relation to engagement and structural sort of or restructuring of laboring spaces in relation to the entry of women's body or in relation to the catering or like the provision of jobs that are more traditionally geared to women. Social reproduction literature does exactly the opposite first. And second, there is not one social reproduction literature at all. And I think this is why we really encourage you to read the collection, because I think they make best use of a variety of approaches. So social reproduction is not one theory, as a long standing discussion that we had among not just our group, but with other groups that focus on social reproduction, neither temporally in relation to the evolution of the debate from the 1970s, nor geographically in relation of the actual sort of processes that you focus on. So, for instance, if I do focus on social reproduction theory, which in my reading provides rather excellent understanding of the reorganization of reproductive sectors and life under capitalism, particularly in the neoliberal moment, you can say that there is a sort of focus on structures, because it's part and parcel of what I think that specific framework excels in. If we go back to early social reproduction debates, and we, as Dan was saying, focus the work of Silvia Federici, but also Leopoldina Fortunati, these are, you know, Selma James, in India, Rohini Hensman was writing at the same time with very similar, you know, sort of insights. I would say that the issue is exactly how to overcome instead this distinction, which runs through much of the feminist economic literature between structural divisions and social norms, this being a false division. And especially those of us working on labor and labor processes and regimes have this very clear, because social norms structure the very discourses that then allowed material processes of extraction and exploitation to be at work. So, and even like the very literature I started from, which is the literature of feminization, make this very clear, that you have first to make someone a secondary worker, or the work of somebody being devalued before the very process of devaluation takes place, like indeed the work of China and Cosku and many others within the collection actually argue. So I think it's exactly the opposite. If we take social reproduction as a vast number of theorizations, which it is, it's the corpus, it's like a strand of literature by now, which is composed of very different approaches. Absolutely one of the things that we can clearly claim is this overcoming this division between structure and agency better than other frameworks.
Great, thank you.
That I think it's fine, but just to say that also Bridget O'Loughlin has written about structure and agency very eloquently, and
I think she's online. I don't know if
yes,
she
I
wants
think
to. I
that
don't want to
she
put her on the
wants to
spot.
be
Okay. Any questions from yes.
Hi.
1, 2, 3. Okay, wait. Warming up. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Hi everyone, my name is Len. I'm Syrian and I'm doing master's in global development. Thank you to all of the speakers, and from my experience working in Syria, especially in food security and livelihoods, I was able to see a lot of what China was talking about, although I was working in the south of Syria under government controlled areas, but I saw the similar issues of exploitative cycles of female laborers. So I was thinking about if there are any, or you can give us some examples of if there are any successful policy applications anywhere in the world to break such exploitative cycles on women working in agriculture.
Thank you.
Okay, hello. Thank you for the presentations. My name is Sandra. I'm Peruvian. I'm doing a PhD in UCL. I'm working on reproduction in toxic landscapes. So landscapes that are probably similar to the one Cosku from Turkey is working on. And I'm wondering, just bringing a curiosity for you. I mean, things that I'm thinking for my project, and I'm wondering if you're finding or thinking about similar things for the places you're working on, which has to do with if in a way you're finding or thinking about the crisis of reproduction or social reproduction in relation to reproduction of non-humans, and how the topic of land comes, I mean, in a new light, if you think it in that way. So just to, because I know that agrarian contexts are not isolated contexts, so they are in many cases in competition with other, in many cases in the global south with extractive economies as well. So in the cases I'm looking at, the reproduction of animals, for instance, many times work as a proxy of the crisis of human reproduction. So in the crisis of how they are unable to reproduce or how their reproduction is altered, they are I mean, there are these interlinkages, and I'm wondering if you are finding that or thinking about that, so.
Thank you very much. Henry, yes, please.
Yeah, my name is Henry Bernstein, already been mentioned several times. Paleolithic, did you say?
Well, I started off, it was pretty many years ago. Too many to.
Yeah. Well, I do go back a long way, and I first of all I want to congratulate you all on this special issue, which I think is really amazing, just at the right time, opening up many things that need to be opened up. And I mean, I'm not completely new to this because my education in some of these areas was partly well, a very important figure in that was Bridget O'Loughlin, this great comrade of my generation. I've got a few questions. One of them, it seems to me, is that in the classes of labour conception, it's very, very difficult to pin down petty commodity production, which is what Cosku was talking about. I've actually read her thesis, but maybe the only one here who has. And I think you can also see that in great work attempted by Jonathan Patton and his village studies in Uganda and in Java. Very, very difficult to distinguish, you know, where petty commodity production comes in. I think one of the reasons probably is that a lot of the petty commodity production we talk about, maybe the supplies to tobacco in Soma region is just so fluid and, you know, has such precarious foundations. So people from classes of labour move in and out of it all the time. I was also very struck by your last slide, Cosku, the quotations, because that is such a typical expression of ideology of the old days were better, you know. And so what we're talking about here, and I think you explore it well historically in your thesis, is current phase of capitalism as it's affecting the Soma area and a previous phase of capitalism. But it's not that the previous phase was some pre or non-capitalist paradise. I mean, that would be absurd. And then I have a question which really plagues me a lot, as Ali knows, which is I don't know what surplus population means.
It's very popular at the moment.
Well, of course it is. And you know, when I read its use, is it helping me understand or is it not helping me?
Yeah.
And if you say surplus to the needs of capital, which I think is a widely used understanding, it's completely moving target. You know, and I think a lot of the literature, and I think that the special issue addresses this and you know takes it head on some of the time, is that you know, these vast masses of informalized workers, you know, quasi peasants, whatever, you know, so on in the global south, they are in very different ways perhaps working for capital. So, you know, what does surplus the requirements of capital mean? I just want to make one last point, footnote, in relation to Ali's answers, question about social norms and so on, is I think there's a great example in the special issue. Well, there are a number, but the one I've read most recently is the one by Brittany Bunce and Donna Hornby and Ben Cousins on their South African case studies, in which reproduction of kinship, ethnicity, church affiliation, all enter into the dynamics of reproduction, but done in a very materialist way.
Thank you very much. Lots of food for thought now for this last 20 minutes, and we are now packed because we have 3 more questions online. So
Shall we take first?
okay,
Yeah,
three,
then,
and then yes.
or you want to see also
Let's
this
try
one?
to be non-capitalistic efficient with this.
Okay,
We can
time.
take them and then each, of us.
You want to
can
go?
just,
Okay, great.
I
So-
trust Sara when it comes to time.
Okay, so we have one on for Cosku actually. Speaking of classes of extractive labor and exploitation of land for mining, are there any mineral beneficiation payments or mining royalties paid to communities whose land has been appropriated for mining? If so, do these payments contribute to household income, and what impact do they have? Additionally, is there a noticeable difference in the social reproduction burdens between households that receive these royalties and those that do not? Okay, then we have a question for everyone. It's a slightly methodological one. How does social reproduction theory help with class analysis? And does the household still serve as a useful unit of class analysis, given that it was local manager of social reproduction with high incidence of migration? Rao et al. Have provided the diets to categories of classes based on social reproduction, but how can it be used more analytically to understand rural labor relations? Thank you, great question. And then we have, I think, Shreya, you mentioned Carla Grass is still online. Do you want to ask your question?
Carla, please.
Carla?
She can't ask it now.
Oh, I really hope
Yeah,
you.
no, but it was quite an empirical question. I wondered because Sara highlighted how the importance of thinking again what a household is, and I wanted to know if you had, if in your fieldwork you have, because still we are speaking of kind of one unique kind of household, and I was wondering if, for example, you have come to see changes in how these households are formed. For example, changes in the size of the household, whether we're still seeing in agrarian settings the historically predominance of extended households or not. This is not, for example, what I'm seeing in my past in my field work, or even the growth of households with one single parent, normally women.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm gonna add.
And I just intersect to also thank Carla massively for this special issue, because she's been a fantastic enabler. I'm very sorry that I just didn't mention Carla and Jens, who's not here, but really without whom this special issue would simply not be out. So thank you.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you for the question. We have the very last question, then 3 minutes each for each of the speakers. So we want to know more for everybody of the different how can we systematize basically the different geographies into a masculine anti-imperialist project, framework that speak to and autonomous agrarian development outside imperialist mode of production and market relations.
No question.
Yeah, exactly. Like for the revolution. Next time. Okay. Cosku, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the questions, but I want you all know that I had no idea that Henry was listening to me when I was making a presentation on the classes of labor. If I knew that, I would be more careful. And unfortunately, my connection was not great, so I could not hear the first question. I'm very sorry about that. Regarding Henry's question, yes, that's very important, because maybe I should have mentioned it earlier. The petty commodity producers that I mentioned in my presentation were the commodity producers before their recent phase of proletarianization as well. They were not subsistence producers. They were, you know, producing for the state economic enterprise. Basically, they were, you know, producing a cash crop, and therefore, yes, the previous phase was okay because there was a strong state support. It was like under the second food regime, let's say. So the reason why their conditions were better before was not because their lives were not independent from capitalism or something. No, they were engaged in capitalist production, but it's kind of indicates the deepening of the commodification of production. However, in terms of social reproduction, the imperatives of social reproduction, you know, got commodified after those investments and after the neoliberal transformation in agriculture, because before, when they were merely commodity producer families, they were able to make their living through subsistence production as well. You know, they were producing for their own use, and they even mentioned that they didn't even used to need money, etc. But still, they were selling their product to the state. And in terms of the, I think it was the second.
No Newman. No, you want the new Newman?
Sorry. I don't understand. In terms
Yeah,
of
go ahead.
Okay. In terms of the you know, impact of, you know, why to you know, how social reproduction framework would help class analysis, I think the best, you know, it really helps to consider class as a plural category without having to leave the relational class analysis within Marxism, just like the concept of classes of labor. You know, it's just like mentioned by Jonathan Pattenden in his book as well. Class is a plural category, but this does not necessarily mean, you know, retreating the relational class analysis of Marxism. And about the question which was written on the chat part, yes, in my case, in my field work, actually, there were basically three types of families, three types of households. One group was, you know, migrants families, but by migrant families, I mean families who are still citizens of Turkey, but they migrated to the Soma Coal Basin from other coal regions where coal is being phased out. And the second group is composed of those whose land has not been expropriated. In terms of land ownership, nothing has changed. They are merely impacted by the impact of neoliberal transformation of agriculture and, you know, the falling prices of tobacco and the lack of state support. The third group, which does not constitute the majority of the interviewees, by the way, my fieldwork lasted for around 6 or 7 years. So I talked to a lot of families. I couldn't even, you know, calculate how many. In terms of the third group, yes, their land was expropriated, but the thing, yes, they received royalties. However, the amount was quite low, and even in order to buy a flat, buy an apartment in the district centers, they had to, you know, use mortgages, etc. Therefore, and the main, you know, impact in that respect is that, you know, they were completely detached from the use of their own lands for subsistence farming as well. Also, their farmlands in which they were engaged in petty commodity production were expropriated, and the money they received from the state was quite low, and it did not help their condition, because it's a farmland used by around 10 or 12 people. They
Okay.
cannot even buy a one apartment. Sorry if if that was too long.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions.
Thank you. Stop.
Yes.
Yes. Do you want to say something in 2-3 minutes about the questions raised?
Okay, yeah,
Any
quickly.
of the questions in particular you want to?
Yeah, on the question of the surplus population,
Good.
I find so for my research, I find Marx's explanation of the relative surplus population quite fitting, but also if I think about Tanya Lee's expansion of it, I find it quite fitting, because if I'm talking about people who are in their 70s, who are in their late 60s, 70s, who are the ones who are really taking care of the households, they are not, in my view, servicing capital. They're not employed. They depend on social grants offered by the state, and Marx refers to that category as the stagnant people who could never exchange their labor anymore. But also there are those who are working, but they are working part-time, 3 months, 4 months in a year. The rest of the year they're just sitting at home. And in my view, I don't see how they are servicing capital if they're sitting at home. So I find the surplus population framing quite useful, at least to explain the kind of people I was engaging with in my thesis. In terms of household, I agree with Cosku. It's also, I mean, it's extended households. People, the main thing that people share resources and labor, because everything is so scarce. One person is employed out of 10 household members. So one moves out of the main house, builds next door for her and her kids, but it's still part of the extended big one, for sharing resources and sharing labor as well. So that's the kind of households that we are, that's the character of households that I encountered. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Ale and Sara?
Yes, very briefly on surplus populations. I always feel, I think I'm nailing it down finally, but I think the issues raised by Marx with reference to the relative surplus population was in a sense thought through for a framework whereby labor was very much centered as a key to accumulation and a key to survival in a capitalist society. But I would say, and this the study of COVID has taught me very much, if you flip the question from labor as your main point of reference to social reproduction, you see a multiplication of the surplus population well beyond the reserve army and debates around that. We have seen it during COVID with the political economy of death, literally, but also we see it with the management of liminal population. So when we think about Palestine, when we think about refugees, it's not through the lens of work that we capture the essence of them being surplus or pushed towards the margins of a number of processes. So in a sense, what I think is the power of social reproduction in relation to debates around surplus population is that it pluralizes the horizon of what it means to be surplus for given communities across our planet today. And it might be in relation to work, or it might be in relation to a number of other processes. Indeed, on this issue, I'm learning huge amount, of course, from Black feminist literature on slavery, particularly Black historians in the US, people like Jennifer Morgan and the likes. In relation to your question, which we don't touch upon here, but I was really, Sara and I are engaged in another partner in crime project, which is a paper on care and social reproduction and the various interlinkages. And there was a whole section of the wages for housework in the United States, led by Black feminists, that was all about the regeneration of life in surrounded by toxic environments. So how much more expensive, how much more extractive, and how much more difficult it is to make life in contexts whereby you cannot grow anything because all the land is polluted and you live close to a sort of a landfill where a number of Black populations in urban areas found themselves. The work of Willamette Brown is what you're looking at, and I learned a lot from that. And otherwise, on issue of ecofeminism, Elena here will know much more than me. But during the Historical Materialism Conference, we will also hear Stefania Barca. So if you're around SOAS, look out for this particular thing. On class analysis and social reproduction, I have far too much to say in a minute, so I'll just leave it there. Maybe, you know, whoever has asked the question just reaches out, but actually you pluralize class, you know, the type of processes of proletarianization and class formations you see by focusing on social reproduction, because rather than talking about waged workers, we talk about a variety of wageless, which has by far represented the bulk of the laboring subjects across the history of capitalism, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Alessandra. I'm going to conclude with two thoughts. The first, although I don't think I'm very particularly well placed to answer your question, Dina, but still, in order to address all of the questions, I'm just going to share a couple of reflections. So in terms of what has been done that is successful in order to address exploitation of women in agriculture, more or less your question was that. I think that what I would look at are instances of collective organizing through either trade unions or when the work is too informalized and there is no proper trade union representation, or trade unions for historical reasons in certain contexts are quite weak. Forms of, you know, like a grassroots organizing of, you know, like the workers coming together. And I think that, you know, these kind of approaches can be very useful. I mean, of course, it's very tough to obtain, you know, to make gains in that sense. But in a way, it is fundamental for that kind of organizing to take place, also for workers, for people, to, you know, like become, you know, like more aware of the agency that they can have in order to try to reverse some exploitative conditions that they're under. So I would look in that direction rather than a top-down approaches on what can we do to women for their exploitation to be lessened, so to speak. And then just one final, I mean, everybody has already contributed to the question on the household, but you know, like one final thought perhaps on this is that you know, on the one hand, there is a point of, you know, like what are households, how have they changed over time, which I think is fundamental, but also from a social reproduction lens, what is really important is to consider how very often when we talk about social reproduction, there is a tendency to implicitly focus on unpaid care work in households. And the point about going beyond the household is to see social reproduction as exceeding the realm of the household. And I think that this is something that, you know, more work could be done on, so.
Thank you very much. And on this very great note, we thank everybody, those online, those here,
Thank you.
It's 2 intense hours. And enjoy the rest of your evening. I don't know if she wants to say something.
And read the special issue, download it.
I just want to say read the special issue and thank you to Lorena for sharing this session today.
Thank you.